Thank you very much. We now come to the backbench motion on the UK response to the human rights and economic situation in Sri Lanka, and I call Elliot Colburn to move.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I beg to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper that this House is concerned by reports of increased militarisation and human rights violations in Sri Lanka, particularly during the country's current economic crisis. And it calls upon the government, as a key stakeholder of the International Monetary Fund, to propose conditionalities on any IMF financial assistance for Sri Lanka during the current economic crisis, including that Sri Lanka carries out a strategic defence and security review to reduce its military spending and remove the military from engaging in commercial activities, that Sri Lanka meets the criteria required for the Generalised Scheme of Preference Plus, and that Sri Lanka re-engages with the United Nations Human Rights Council process and fully implements Resolution 30.1 and subsequent amendments, and calls upon the government to implement a targeted set of sanctions against individuals who are credibly accused of committing war crimes during the Sri Lankan Civil War. Can I begin by thanking the Backbench Business Committee for making time for this important debate, and can I particularly thank my right honourable friend, the member for Chipping Barnet, the member for Richmond Park, the member for East Ham, the member for High Wycombe, and indeed the dozens of other colleagues who have sponsored the application for this debate. And I declare an interest as chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Tamils and as a Member of Parliament representing thousands of Tamil constituents in Carshalton and Wallington. And it's to those constituents first that I would like to thank for reaching out to me to talk more about the situation in Sri Lanka, as well as the various community groups we have heard as part of the APPG since the Parliament was reformed in 2019. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's been over 13 years since the Civil War came to an end, and the origins of that conflict stretched back several decades and resulted in well over 100,000 deaths from all sides. However, it was during the final months of the conflict in 2009 which saw things take a particularly bloody turn for the worst. During this period, the Sri Lankan military deliberately targeted thousands of civilian lives, committing grotesque genocidal acts, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, largely against the Tamil population of the island. The culmination of these atrocities was the Mulavai massacre. In 2009, a strip of land in Mulavai, Sri Lanka, was designated as a so-called no-fire zone. These were designated areas where civilians were told to gather to avoid being harmed. However, nothing could be further from the truth in Mulavai. Sri Lankan government forces entrapped tens of thousands of civilians in the zone and committed heinous war crimes. After providing an initial death toll of 40,000, the United Nations found evidence suggested that as many as 70,000 were killed. Local census records indicate that at least 146,679 people are still unaccounted for and presumed to have been killed. By examining different sources, including the United Nations, census figures and World Bank data, the International Truth and Justice Project has found that the highest estimate of those killed during that final phase could be as large as 169,796. Most of these deaths were as a result of the Sri Lankan government forces shelling civilian buildings, including hospitals. There were also reports of civilian bunkers being targeted with grenades, people being run over by military vehicles, and surrendering civilians being stripped naked and executed. Rape and sexual violence. I will gladly give way.
Can I thank the Honourable Member for giving way and commend him on what is a really brave and accurate speech, in my opinion. Would he agree with me that all the things he's cited about the bombing of hospitals, the bombing of people on the beach, the targeting of Tamils fits the definition of a genocide?
I'm grateful to my constituency neighbour for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with her. I think one of the shocking things that we have heard, and she will know this as a member of the APPG, is that those credibly accused of committing these war crimes have been or have recently been or still currently are serving at the top level of Sri Lankan society. That is absolutely shocking, but I will come on to some more of that in my speech, and I will gladly give way.
I thank and congratulate the Honourable Member for having secured this very important debate, because many of my Slough constituents are extremely concerned about the safety and well-being of their loved ones, given the reports of increased militarisation and human rights violation, particularly when the country is going through a severe economic crisis. Does the Honourable Member agree with me that as friends of Sri Lanka, we all have a duty to stand by Sri Lanka in its time of need and impress upon the new government there to promote peace, justice and a brighter future for all, regardless of their background or colour or creed?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for that intervention, and I do absolutely agree with him. I'm very, very glad that the government has decided to support this motion today so that we can get to work on bringing everyone back around the table, because we have seen so little progress on implementing UN resolutions so far, and there is a lot of hopelessness out there, particularly amongst the Tamil community, that any progress is going to be made. So we really do need to get on top of this and use our position as a friend of Sri Lanka to do just that. So I'm grateful to him for his intervention. Now, if I could talk a little bit more, Mr. Deputy Speaker, about some of the violence and atrocities used during the end of the conflict. Rape and sexual violence against Tamil women, and indeed some reports of Tamil men during the final stages of the armed conflict and in its aftermath, are also considered to be greatly underreported, and that's according to an OHCHR investigation on Sri Lanka. Several witnesses have spoken about women being taken away towards the jungle by soldiers allegedly for sexual abuse as they crossed over into government-controlled territory. An investigation by Human Rights Watch reported on one woman's experience, which she explains. The army made us strip completely in front of the children. All the women were made to walk around the soldiers in a circle. The soldiers were laughing at us. All of the women were then raped in front of everyone. My daughter and I were raped in front of her children. I was raped in front of my grandchildren. After about 2 hours, the soldiers asked a naked boy and girl who didn't know each other to hug each other at gunpoint. As they hugged due to fear, they were shot in front of our eyes. Mr. Deputy Speaker, these atrocities didn't take place in a medieval skirmish some hundreds of years ago. They took place in a Commonwealth country in 2009. Many of my constituents and other members of this place have suffered to this day because of the crimes that they saw or were subjected to, and the physical and mental scars are still there. And 13 years later, these families are still waiting for peace, justice, truth, and accountability. Now, I am pleased that last month the UN Human Rights Council adopted Resolution 51/L1 on Sri Lanka, which will extend and reinforce the capacity of the Office of the High Commissioner to collect, consolidate, analyse and preserve evidence that may be used in future war crimes trials. Now, of course, the Sri Lankan government has rejected this resolution, as it has before, instead claiming confidence in their own domestic mechanisms, which, 13 years on since the end of the war, are yet to produce any results for victims of the atrocities. The new resolution certainly is a step in the right direction to achieve justice and accountability, but with respect, we've had resolutions before. International action at the Human Rights Council on its own is not enough, and the resolution falls short of providing a mechanism to truly investigate war crimes and pursue criminal accountability. Specific resources are needed to be raised to build cases against those who are accused of war crimes and be prosecuted. Now, criminal accountability should be pursued by referral to the International Criminal Court. Those who commit war crimes should not enjoy immunity because the state in question is unwilling or unable to prosecute them. Furthermore, the UK should follow other allies from around the world, particularly the United States, and introduce a targeted sanctions regime for those who are credibly accused of committing war crimes and human rights abuses in Sri Lanka. Now, this should include notable Sri Lankan individuals such as Sharendra Silva, the current army commander. General Silva stands credibly accused of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity during the final phases of the conflict. The accused war criminal was head of the notorious 58 Division during the conflict. Silver's experience as a commander oversaw the unit commit grave violations of international law, and under his command, hospitals were repeatedly bombed and widespread sexual violence, torture and execution of surrendering Tamils occurred. Eyewitnesses also demonstrated that General Silver was present at the Woodavai Bridge, where, according to the available evidence, he oversaw hundreds of surrendering Tamil military and political leaders and their families being subjected to summary execution and arbitrary detention, as well as enforced disappearance. I will gladly give way.
Congratulate the honourable member on securing this important debate today. The implementation of vague laws to facilitate arbitrary arrests restriction of movement on citizens is something we see in countries with poor human rights records. Laws like this in Sri Lanka make it much harder for those wrongly arrested to challenge detention. So does the honourable member share my concern that access to justice is being actively hindered and leaving activists at too great a risk?
I'm grateful to the honourable member for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with her. But I would just add an extra layer on this. The difficulty in Sri Lanka is not just the fact that there are those held on false pretences and false charges, but there's also a gravely high number of people who are still missing. We don't know where they are. We don't know where they're being held. So we can't help them. If they're still alive, there is no way of helping those people, and that's the grave situation that islanders are facing at the moment. Now, the UN High Commission on Human Rights has recommended that states, including the UK, should sanction Silva and other alleged perpetrators in Sri Lanka, and the United States did so in 2020. Another individual worth noting is Kamal Goratne, who is the current Defence Secretary in Sri Lanka. In February 2009, he led the final assault from the south of the beaches at Mulavai Cow as the 53rd Division Commander. The assault involved repeated attacks on civilian hospitals, makeshift hospitals and food distribution points, resulting in tens of thousands of civilian casualties. He was also charged of displaced persons whilst hundreds of thousands of civilians... He was also in charge, of displaced persons whilst hundreds of thousands of civilians were held in arbitrary detention after the end of the war, and he was commander of the Joseph Army Camp, which was notorious for torture. By sanctioning these two individuals and many others, the UK government would be supporting both UN and US action in demonstrating that alleged perpetrators of mass atrocities are not welcome in the UK. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, members of the APPG for Tamils have raised this issue multiple times here in the Chamber, as well as privately and through other channels to the SCDO. So I do hope that the Minister today can provide an encouraging update on the government's position regarding the sanctioning of individuals credibly accused of war crimes. I will gladly give way.
Forward and minded of the fact that the officers may give the commands to do what happens, but the soldiers who do it are also accountable. So when it comes to having their time in court, which we hope they will have, does the honourable gentleman agree that the doing everything to try and catch those soldiers as well is important? The generals can be got because they're big names, but the soldiers need to know they can't get away with it either.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member for that intervention, and I do absolutely agree with him, and I do hope that the UK sees that, that new resolution that has been passed at the Human Rights Council in terms of collecting evidence should indeed include those specific soldiers who committed those atrocities as well. Now, of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, the atrocities that occurred in the past in Sri Lanka are only one of the reasons that we're having this debate today. The second part of the motion is about the current economic and political instability in Sri Lanka. Now, the country is suffering its worst economic crisis since gaining independence in 1948. The country defaulted on a $51 billion external debt in mid-April and is in talks with the IMF for a $2.9 billion bailout. Now, due to shortage of hard currency to pay for imports, there have been shortages of basic necessities, including medicines, cooking gas, fuel and food. 3.4 million people are now in need of urgent humanitarian help on the islands. And UN agencies working in Sri Lanka announced just yesterday that they had raised $79 million to feed those in need. But the increasing number of those in need means that another 70 million is estimated to be needed. In July, the new president imposed a state of emergency after his predecessor fled the country and resigned from post following massive anti-government protests about the government's mishandling of the economy, which threw the country into further instability. Now, the SCDO has updated their travel advice over the summer to advise against all but essential travel to the island due to the political and economic instability on the island. Now, the causes of Sri Lanka's financial crisis are multifaceted. Failure to include Tamils, indeed, I will gladly give way.
Does he share my concern that military spending is higher now in Sri Lanka than it was at the height of the civil war? And surely that expenditure is contributing to the debt crisis that the country is facing?
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for that intervention. She's been a doughty champion for the Tamil population throughout many, many years in this place, and I'm grateful to her lending her expertise to this debate today. And indeed, one of the points I hope to come on to later is indeed just that. As I was saying, Mr Deputy Speaker, the failure to include Tamils in economic activity, a large defence budget, as my honourable friend has mentioned, to support a disproportionately large military, corruption and, of course, poor fiscal policies have led Sri Lanka's economy to the brink of bankruptcy. And in order for Sri Lanka to be rescued, it needs to reduce its military spending, which stands at $1.86 billion per annum, making it one of the largest militaries in the world, costing more than their health and education budgets combined. The militarisation of the country is also firmly linked to deteriorating human rights concerns on the island. The inaction and the use of the Prevention of Terrorism Act has been used predominantly to target Muslim and Tamil communities, resulting in arbitrary detention, sexual torture, and enforced disappearances. In fact, Sri Lanka has the second highest number of UN-registered enforced disappearances in the world, and most of them are Tamils. Furthermore, the Sri Lankan military is engaged in commercial activities in the northeast, including tourism, farming, and fishing, stifling the local economy and preventing Tamils from contributing in any meaningful way to economic activity. Now, this needs to be stopped in order to allow for regional economic regeneration. Furthermore, Sri Lanka needs to conduct a strategic and defence and security review, like the one the UK completed in 2021, to ensure its military size reflects its security requirements. Mr Deputy Speaker, all of Sri Lanka's projections to emerge out of the economic crisis are predicated on the country retaining its Generalised Scheme of Preference Plus trade concessions. The annual trade concession is worth over $500 million and has boosted Sri Lanka's exports to EU member states over the years. However, Sri Lanka has failed to meet key human rights and labour requirements for receiving this preferential treatment. The EU recently issued a warning to Sri Lanka that it was set to lose its concession if it continues to ignore its obligations. I will gladly give way.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm very grateful to the honourable member for securing this debate and raising these very important matters. Does he agree with me that it's also vital that the UK government demonstrates its support for fair and just development of Sri Lanka through its own trade policy with Sri Lanka? Now we secure our own trade agreements.
For that intervention, and he took the following words that I was about to read just out of my mouth, so I'm very grateful to him for that. In order for Sri Lanka to meet these requirements, it needs to re-engage with the UNHRC and address the human rights abuses, both past and present. Sri Lanka is now seeking its third IMF bailout since the end of the war in 2009, and bailout conditions set by the IMF in the past have focused on economic reform alone and has not prevented Sri Lanka from sliding back to yet another balance of payment crisis. It is vital that the measurements taken this time around are comprehensive and address some of the root causes that the country is facing to elevate Sri Lanka out of the cyclical crisis that it finds itself in. And as a key stakeholder at the IMF, the UK government should propose conditionalities on any IMF financial assistance for Sri Lanka during the current economic crisis, including that Sri Lanka carries out a strategic defence and security review to reduce its military spending, remove the military from engaging in commercial activities, and that Sri Lanka should meet the requirements required for the GSP Plus scheme, and that Sri Lanka re-engages with the UNHRC process. I appreciate that the IMF does not have powers to impose such conditionalities on its own, but the UK, as a key penholder here, can add that significant influence whilst those discussions are taking place before any bailout is agreed. I will gladly give way.
One of the issues that we've consistently raised, in addition to the human rights abuses, is the levels of corruption within Sri Lanka itself. One of the ways in which we've been able to at least expose and tackle that corruption has been through the media, some elements of the excellent media that there is in Sri Lanka, but where there has been, certainly over the last 12 months, but over a longer period as well, but intensively over the last 12 months, the harassment of journalists and the closure down of the free press that there is and the free media that there is there. One of the conditions that should be attached to any form of aid that goes into Sri Lanka now, or any relationship that we have in the future, is one in which they tackle corruption, but they do that as a result of the free media, unharassed by government.
Honourable Member for that intervention, and I absolutely agree with his point about the importance of a free press. And that indeed is having effects beyond the borders of the island. Indeed, a prominent Tamil news outlet, the Tamil Guardian, has been repeatedly engaged in battles with social media companies about their content. The investigations that have been taking place is that Sri Lankan government is actively trying to force social media companies worldwide, not just within the borders of the island, but here in the UK, the Tamil Guardian has had its content taken offline because of complaints from the Sri Lankan state. That cannot be right. I'm conscious that I've been speaking for quite a while, Mr Deputy Speaker, so I want to bring my remarks to a close so we can hear from other backbenchers. I will gladly give way first, though.
Giving way to making a speech in which I would totally agree with. I just want to check, because it's really helpful when we have all-party agreement on this. For all the reasons he set out, does he not agree that we need to review the generalised system of preferences that is given to Sri Lanka? They are not meeting the conditions that they're supposed to. It's time, I think, to withdraw those.
I totally agree with the right honourable gentleman. Indeed, that's as we've set out in our motion today, which I'm glad is going through unopposed. That is indeed what I think the UK government should be doing. To conclude, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do look forward to hearing from the Minister about what engagement the FCDO has had with the IMF and the UNHRC on this matter. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, the human rights and economic situation in Sri Lanka is increasingly deteriorating. In this brief time that I've had, I hope that I've demonstrated succinctly why the UK does need to show international leadership on these issues, not just for our constituents who are still affected by the events that have taken place, but continue to take place on the island, but also to fulfil our international responsibility to a Commonwealth partner in dire need. And I look forward to hearing contributions from other members throughout the course of this debate.
The question is, as on the order paper, Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And can I thank all those involved in securing this debate and declare an interest as a Vice Chair of the APPG for Tamils. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate, not least to represent my constituents in Kingston and Surbiton from the Tamil community. They were appalled, as I think we all were, to see the devastating economic situation which has unfolded in Sri Lanka over the past year or so. And as the Honourable Member said, it was a direct result of the economic mismanagement of the Sri Lankan government, the corruption of the Sri Lankan government, their unfunded tax cuts, their huge defence spending. That's all related to the appalling crisis which is hitting Sri Lankans from all communities. I do, however, want to focus on the impact on the Tamil community in my remarks. There are an estimated 5 million Tamils in Sri Lanka today, and they have endured the recent economic crisis after a whole series of what can only be described as oppression, indeed, in many cases, a genocide. From the civil war to the poor treatment they have now, the human rights abuses, the abuse of the free press, the abuse of the judiciary, the Sri Lankan state continues to target Tamils in some of the most unfair way imaginable. And I'm sure other Right Honourable members have constituents who've come to Sri Lanka who can testify personally of the abuses they've had at the hands of the Sri Lankan police and military and security forces. And given that we know that from people who are now our own citizens and can give witness to it in the way that the Honourable Gentleman spoke, this country has got a duty. We do have, more or less, a pretty good history of defending human rights around the world, and we've got to continue that when it comes to standing up for Sri Lankan Tamils. And I particularly want to focus my remarks on the generalised scheme of preferences in relation to trade. I'm delighted it's in the motion today, and I really hope the Minister will respond on this. It's an area I looked at in some detail. As Trade Minister between 2010 and 2012, I led a campaign at the EU to prevent Sri Lanka being awarded what the EU calls the GSP plus trade benefits. The evidence that I looked at was overwhelming that Sri Lanka was in breach, blatant breach, of all the conditions, or most of the conditions, that it was supposed to have met to be given the GSP plus benefits, and particularly in breach in regard to various conventions with respect to human rights. And I'm pleased to report that back then, the UK was successful in stopping the Clumber government getting those valuable rights. Regrettably, in 2015-16, the UK government strongly supported other EU member states and together granted those trade benefits to Sri Lanka. And what worried me at the time, although I was no longer temporarily not in this House, Mr Deputy Speaker, but looking in, was there was no debate about the fact that Sri Lanka was still clearly in breach of the conditions and the framework conditions around the GSP Plus system. But that was not taken into account and was not highlighted in debate. When I have engaged, and I've engaged not just in this country but at the EU on this issue, you will hear officials say, well, the argument for giving Sri Lanka these benefits is that it enables the EU and the UK to exercise some influence, that they can, through the existence of the trade benefits, monitor whether the Sri Lankan government is abiding by the conditions or making progress towards meeting the conditions. I have to say, I've never found that argument terribly convincing. But it's a very convenient argument, isn't it? Well, we know they're in breach, but they're going to make some progress, so we'll forget the conditions existed. That's not good enough, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And let's give it some credit. Let's imagine that those international monitors, either from the EU or the UK, were there and were engaging. Is there any evidence that that influence has resulted in any change in the performance of the Sri Lankan government in the regard of those conditions? And I'm afraid, once again, the overwhelming evidence is no. The Sri Lankan government just continues. In fact, if anything, the situation has deteriorated. So I'm afraid the argument that is sometimes made that, it's okay, let's have those conditions, we have a relationship, we can use that, it's just not working. And I think we can only conclude that Sri Lanka has to be stripped of these trade benefits. Now, some may argue there's an economic crisis, that it would be the wrong time to do that. Well, I'm not against IMF support as long as it's got conditions and real conditions, whether it's respect to human rights, whether it's respect to the Sri Lankan government agreeing to go to an independent mechanism of accountability for its actions, as we have all argued, include maybe media rights as well can be included in those list of conditions. But I just think on GSP Plus we have to send a real signal. Until they properly implement the United Nations Human Rights Council's resolution, I think we can't continue as we have been doing since 2015-16. You might argue that we should go further. I think we should. I think the draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act that the Sri Lankan government has implemented and enforces primarily against Tamils and Muslim Sri Lankans, actually, that act really needs to be repealed. Just one note to the Minister, though, and he may or may not have heard this or been briefed on it, but I hear reports that the Sri Lankan government is thinking of repealing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, but replacing it with a system based on the Chinese system of managing these types of issues. And there's no doubt that would be a backward step as the Chinese influence in Colombo increases, and it would not help the Tamils whatsoever. The government really now needs to move beyond words. We need some real actions as is contained in this motion. I've written to both the Foreign Affairs Committee and the International Trade Committee. I think it's time for a joint inquiry in this Parliament into the interaction between the UK's foreign policy and our international trade. I think if we've learned anything from the last year, particularly from Sri Lanka, but more broadly as well, the challenging geopolitical situation that's now facing us means that these two must be joined up. And, you know, we could debate other countries, but it would be probably out with this debate today. But I think there's many other countries for which that inquiry would be helpful. But back to Sri Lanka, I think we've got to look at the whole series of foreign policy tools. The Magnitsky sanctions regime surely must be applied. And applying the full force of those types of sanctions to people like the Rajapaksa brothers. There is such evidence in the international community from what remains of the free press in Sri Lanka that they have committed not just the most shocking policies on Sri Lanka, not just the corruption, but also they were responsible in overseeing the heinous atrocities and the war crimes, particularly in 2009. And the case for acting is made stronger because some of our closest allies have already acted. The United States hasn't been as squeamish as the UK government, so we do have to move. Now, when I look at what the UK government has done at the United Nations Human Rights Council, I think for me it's glass half empty. The resolution 51/1 was welcome, but it really wasn't tough enough. Now, the Minister may say in the negotiations that went on at Geneva, the words had to change in order to bring more people on to support it. The UK was a pen holder, and maybe the Minister can enlighten the House about the sorts of diplomatic arguments, you know, why was the resolution as weak as it was. I still sometimes think that in those sorts of debates in the chambers of the UN, we just have to stand up for what we really believe in. And I think there's such a strong case to be made to Sri Lanka. We can have tougher resolutions, and they need to be tougher. And I hope the government will go further. And I'm bringing my remarks to an end, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But I hope we will go further. I hope the UK government will work through the UN for those stronger mechanisms. I think we should be promoting the case for taking Sri Lanka's government to the International Criminal Court. I actually welcomed what the Prime Minister said, I think it was just a week ago, the new Prime Minister, making it clear that his government supports the International Criminal Court. Sometimes his predecessors seemed to wobble on that, so I was really pleased that he made that commitment. But once again, we've got to move beyond words, and we've got a campaign to use that court proactively against war criminals like the Rajapaksa brothers. I'm looking forward, Mr. Deputy Speaker, to listen to other right honourable members. It is very good that we've come together to talk to our government, and I hope from all sides the government will hear that there is impatience for stronger action. Given what is happening in Sri Lanka, what's happened for years now, we really got to flex our muscles on this. Thank you.
Civilians.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank my honourable friend for Carshalton and Wallington for securing this debate and for the very powerful speech that he just made to open it. And it's also a pleasure to follow on from the Right Honourable Member from Kingston and Surbiton, who also contributed effectively and powerfully to this debate. And thank you to the Backbench Committee for making it possible. I'd like to declare an interest as the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils, and also to say that members of the British Tamil community have supported me in many ways over the years, including assistance with fundraising and also making it possible for me to visit the UN in Geneva to make the case for justice for Tamils in Sri Lanka. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, as we've heard already this afternoon, many thousands of Tamils died in the closing months of that terrible civil war, and many are still unaccounted for. And I found the descriptions that we heard from the member from Carshalton and Wallington truly harrowing, no matter how often one is told about these appalling episodes of gender-based violence and other sorts of violence. It is still deeply disturbing to hear of these happening in the modern era in a Commonwealth country. Yes.
For giving way. I'm deeply concerned about the lack of progress in women's rights in Sri Lanka. Girls can still be married from as young as 12. Women remain second-class citizens, which is no place in the modern world. So does the Right Honourable Member agree women need further support in Sri Lanka and that this must be a focal point?
I do agree with that, and I know it's a development priority for the UK government to support the empowerment of women and girls around the world. And I certainly hope that these matters are ones that ministers will raise with their counterparts in Sri Lanka. Families of the disappeared have been protesting for more than 2,000 days, demanding answers in relation to what happened to their missing loved ones. The establishment of the Office of Missing Persons looked like such a positive step forward, tangible progress following UNHRC resolutions. But the depressing reality is that the OMP has not been able to trace a single person in its list of over 6,000 cases, nor has it clarified the fate of the disappeared in any meaningful way. Such was the conclusion of UN Human Rights Commissioner Bachelet. She is also clear that the human rights situation in Sri Lanka is deteriorating. It is not just Tamils who suffer as a result. Muslims have also been targeted, as have Sinhala people who have joined some of the widespread protests about economic failure. So let no one think that the great questions we are debating today here in the Mother of Parliaments are only about legacy matters, important though those matters are. The oppressive security apparatus of the Sri Lankan state is still being used to exert control over the country's citizens. People are still being arrested and detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, despite the promise made by the Sri Lankan government in Resolution 30/1 7 years ago to repeal it. The military remain entrenched in economic activities across the north and east. They retain control of swathes of land confiscated from Tamils, and senior military figures still hold prominent positions in government, some of them only appointed in recent years. It is frankly astonishing that spending on the armed forces is greater today than at the height of the conflict, outstripping, as we've heard, the combined total of the health and education budgets. This must have contributed to the debt crisis in Sri Lanka. In short, the Rajapaksa regime wrecked the economy, and as yet, there seems little visible progress under its successor. So, as members have already acknowledged today, this is a situation of deep crisis in both economic and human rights terms. And when he responds, I hope the Minister will commit the government here to the following actions. That they will push strongly in the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva for the Sri Lankan government to meet its obligations which it undertook in Resolution 30/1 and which the Human Rights Council reiterated so recently in Resolution 51/1. The UK government has a good record of being the penholder in this process and making a real difference, but it must keep up the pressure in the light of a deteriorating situation. Secondly, that in the light of continued failure to bring war criminals to justice, progress must be made on an international mechanism to deliver accountability at last. This is an issue that cannot wait any longer. Thirdly, that they impose Magnitsky sanctions on those figures credibly implicated in war crimes and human rights abuses, as has been the case in countries such as the United States. And fourthly, that they find a way to ensure that any bailout from international institutions must be accompanied by rigorous efforts to root out cronyism and corruption in Sri Lanka and cut that irrationally large military spending budget. And finally, that the UK government advocate for a new constitutional settlement in Sri Lanka that delivers power sharing and political equality to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Tamil people to have a real say in how they are governed. Sri Lanka has a tragic past, as shown by the film Continuing Cycles of Violence and Genocide in Sri Lanka. This was created by members of the British Tamil community and screened here in Parliament at an event I hosted for the British Tamil Forum in July. It is truly shocking to see the recurrent pattern of violence and injustice directed towards Tamils over many decades. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think there are grounds for hope. Recent protests saw people from diverse backgrounds, faiths, ethnicities come together to demand change, to demand a better future for all Sri Lankans. Let all of us in this House and in this government play our part in helping them reach that historic goal. Thank you.
Siobhan McDonough.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And my thanks to colleagues from the APPG for the Tamil community for securing this incredibly important debate. For 13 long years since the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, the road to truth, justice and accountability has presented the Tamil community with so many challenges, so little progress and so much pain. No one who saw the images of the final days of the Civil War could possibly forget them, with the mass violation of human rights leaving a stain of injustice on Sri Lanka. The world looked away, but today we will not, because the ongoing crisis in Sri Lanka is having a devastating effect, with skyrocketing inflation and shortages of basic essentials like food and medicine. Close to half of the population now live below the poverty line, and the UN warns that approximately a third of the population is experiencing food insecurity. This is a crisis in democracy, decades in the making. The world turned away when the Rajapaksa government cluster-bombed their own people, committing genocide, murdered their journalists and enriched a small group led by one family. Their malign dynastic control stripped the economy bare, leaving behind a broken nation on the brink of economic collapse. The International Crisis Group points to Gotabaya's authoritarian, centralised and non-transparent decision-making, describing the administration as surrounded by cronies and oblivious to criticism, and that it rejected repeated calls for a course correction as the crisis deepened. So what should happen now? First, the country agreed a preliminary deal with the IMF in September for a loan of $2.9 billion. An IMF bailout is essential, but does the Minister agree that any financial assistance must go hand in hand with democratic and human rights reforms, in particular for the Tamil community? Meanwhile, during the current crisis, the Sri Lankan government has once more shown its brutal face by aggressively cracking down on protesters under draconian anti-terror legislation. Like Wasantha Mudalij, convener of Inter-University Student Federation, who was arrested at a peaceful protest in August. They agreed with the UN and the EU that they will either change or abolish the Prevention of Terrorism Act. Instead, they are using it in full force creating unsafe conditions for all political activists, human rights and democratic rights defenders. Third, we should be extremely concerned at the findings of the UN High Commissioner regarding the Office of Missing Persons, stating that it seems to be aimed at reducing the caseload and closing files rather than a comprehensive approach to establish the truth and ensure justice and redress to families. Oh, yes.
There's a tragic irony for some of our constituents who have actually gone out to Sri Lanka to look for the disappeared and have been disappeared themselves. That's the failure of the whole system to have accountability in the investigation in an effective way.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. For years and years, families have searched for their loved ones. Wives have sought their husbands, their sons, their brothers, and nothing happens. And irrespective of the international community and its demands, nothing happens. Every Tamil family knows someone who is missing. What steps have been taken to address this worrying judgment? Fourth, in the most recent UN resolution to which the UK was a penholder, why was there no recommendation to pursue criminal accountability by referral to the International Criminal Court? I could barely believe my eyes reading the government's reasoning, citing insufficient Security Council support. Who are we to cast the veto for China or Russia before they have done so themselves? Our role on the international stage must be to send the loudest message that impunity will not be tolerated, not to preempt the inaction of other nations. And finally, why has Britain failed to impose Majinsky-style sanctions on any Sri Lankan official implicated on human rights abuses or corruption? On this side of the House, we firmly believe that those who have been involved in such crimes should be brought to justice. I hope the Minister will see the strength of cross-party feeling on the issues raised today. I know that the Tamil community in my constituency will be listening carefully to the answers given. And so, Mr Deputy Speaker, may I finish by thanking all for their contribution to Mitcham and Morden, and by saying loud and clear that however long the road to reconciliation may still be, we will keep fighting for justice and human rights until they are achieved.
Only.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to declare an interest as Vice Chair of the APPG for Tamils, along with other members who've already contributed to this excellent debate, which is a privilege to be able to take part in. I'd like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting myself and fellow Vice Chairs of the APPG for Tamils the opportunity to hold this important debate, and I think the importance was really highlighted by the Chair for the APPG in his very, very powerful opening speech, which really covered off already many of the points that I want to make, but there's a few bits that I'd like to amplify. It's a pleasure to represent also the Tamil constituents, my Tamil constituents in Parliament. My constituency of Richmond Park is home to a vibrant Tamil community, and in the borough of Kingston alone there are around 12,000 Tamils. Tamil is one of the most commonly spoken languages. And it was an honour to attend Tamil Heritage Month celebrations in New Malden earlier this year, and at these celebrations a plaque was unveiled to commemorate Kingston being twinned with Jaffna, historic city in the Tamil homeland of northern Sri Lanka. And this plaque now serves as an important physical reminder of the close cultural ties between our two cities. But while we celebrate the contribution of the Tamil population to the UK, it's vital that we also remember and acknowledge the hardship that the community has experienced and continues to experience in Sri Lanka. And I share in the concern expressed by my constituents and fellow members of this House for the devastating economic and political crisis that has unfolded in Sri Lanka. The economic crisis was self-inflicted. Ordinary people have been left to suffer the consequences of the Sri Lankan government's economic mismanagement, resulting in runaway inflation, power blackouts and fuel rationing. For the Tamil community, this period has also been marked by ongoing oppression and violation of their human rights. The homeland of the minority Tamil population in northeast Sri Lanka has seen a dramatic increase in military presence. According to the British Tamil Forum, there's now 1 soldier for every 6 civilians in the region. That's an intimidatingly high concentration of military personnel. Defence spending has also soared way above and beyond previous levels, contributing towards the economic crisis. Months of mass protests erupted this year over lack of food and worsening humanitarian and economic conditions. The Sri Lankan people have spoken out and demanded change. As a country with close historic links to Sri Lanka, the United Kingdom has a critical role to play in ensuring the humanitarian impact of this crisis is mitigated. I therefore join honourable members in calling on the government to use its international standing and position within the United Nations, the Commonwealth and the IMF to support a peaceful political reform in Sri Lanka. It is vital that any such representations are communicated to parliamentarians. Can the Minister therefore provide an update on the conversations the UK Foreign Office has held with international partners to discuss their response to the economic and political situation in Sri Lanka? I also join my colleagues from the APPG for Tamils in urging the UK Government to use its role as a key stakeholder of the IMF to call for conditionalities to be imposed on any financial assistance provided to Sri Lanka. As written in our motion before the House today, such conditionalities should support demilitarisation by requiring that Sri Lanka carries out a strategic defence and security review to reduce its military spending. We cannot stand by and allow IMF assistance to line the coffers of corrupt politicians. The UK's commitment to a peaceful and democratic settlement in Sri Lanka must be shown right from the top level of government. The Prime Minister was photographed meeting with Sri Lankan President Ranil Wickremesinghe at COP27 just a few days ago. In light of the continued oppression of the Tamil population at the hands of the current administration, it's vital that the Prime Minister uses such opportunities to make constructive representations. There's been no official readout published of this meeting. Can the Minister confirm that the Prime Minister raised concerns for the Tamil population to the Sri Lankan President? It would be hugely disappointing if he did not, and raise further questions around the Prime Minister's judgment. Since the end of the civil war, over 100,000 Tamils remain unaccounted for and presumed dead. 13 years later, many of those responsible for atrocious crimes against the Tamil population have borne no responsibility for their actions. It is clear that domestic mechanisms for accountability in Sri Lanka have eroded and failed over the past few years. The Sri Lankan government seems set only to continue along the same path of denial and delay. The UK government must not turn a blind eye to the injustices of the past. We are calling on the government to take the vital step in finally recognising the crimes committed against the Tamil population as a genocide. Only once this has been achieved will the UK be truly honouring our human rights commitments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr Murray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I would like to congratulate honourable and right honourable members for securing this important debate, which gives me the opportunity as well to speak about the human rights and economic situation in Sri Lanka, a situation which is of great concern to a number of my constituents in Ealing North. Like many of my constituents, I have been deeply concerned by the ongoing violence and the suppression of peaceful protesters in Sri Lanka as the economic crisis on the island continues to unfold. Just over the weekend, we saw peaceful protesters face violence at the hands of the Sri Lankan police officers as they demonstrated against the detention of 2 student leaders. This is just one of the latest examples of the arbitrary detention of minority groups such as Tamils and Muslims, which has now expanded to include the Sinhala population, as the state's security forces have clamped down on the mass protests that have taken place in Colombo over recent months. I've also heard disturbing reports that the Sri Lankan army, which continues to maintain a military presence in the northeast of the country, has been disrupting the Tamil community as they prepare to commemorate victims of armed conflict. Over the last week, Tamils in the northeast have begun preparations for Mabura Nal, or Great Heroes Day, which falls on November 27th. I've been very concerned to hear that these preparations have been disrupted by plainclothed officers in what appears to be an attempt to intimidate Tamils from organising any memorial activities. Mr Deputy Speaker, as the current economic and political crises have gripped Sri Lanka, I've been contacted by many of my constituents who have been deeply concerned about the conduct of the former Rajapaksa government. I've written to the Minister for South Asia, Lord Ahmed, on multiple occasions and pressed him on what the UK government is doing to support Sri Lanka with the economic situation and to help bring an end to the violence that has erupted. The current economic crisis has left close to half of the population living below the poverty line, whilst a third of the population face food insecurity. The people of Sri Lanka need the UK to do all we can to help bring an end to this. Alongside help with the immediate economic and political situation, many of my constituents, particularly from the Tamil community, have made very clear the importance of their continued fight for accountability and justice for what happened during the Sri Lankan Civil War. As we've heard from other honourable members, the UNHRC has passed resolutions on this matter and the UK has been the penholder. The most recent resolution that was passed last month renewed the mandate of the Office for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to report on Sri Lanka and to protect and preserve evidence of past human rights abuses to use in future accountability processes. However, Sri Lanka is not complying with the resolutions, and so the UK must introduce targeted sanctions on individuals who are credibly accused of war crimes. Earlier this year, I met with a group of Tamil constituents to discuss General Shivendra Silva, a member of the Sri Lankan army who was sanctioned by the US government due to allegations of human rights violations during the Sri Lankan Civil War. Silva was the head of Sri Lanka's notorious 58 Division, an army unit that committed grave violations of international law and oversaw a military offensive that killed tens of thousands of Tamils. I would urge the Minister to commit the government to sanctioning General Silva under the terms of the British government's global human rights sanctions regime. Mr Deputy Speaker, the people of Sri Lanka are facing a desperate economic situation, whilst peaceful protesters face violent suppression. This comes after so many years during which people in the country and beyond, particularly from the Tamil community, have been fighting for accountability for what happened during the Civil War. As an MP representing so many constituents with strong ties to Sri Lanka, I today repeat my calls on the government to give whatever support it can to bring an end to the immediate economic crisis and violence and to support the ongoing fight for justice.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the member for Carshalton and Willington for securing this debate, together with the Vice Chairs of the APPGs, and of course my thanks to the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate. The significant Tamil and Sri Lankan communities of Leicester East are watching with interest this debate. Many have experienced the atrocities firsthand. They are deeply troubled by the appalling human rights abuses and worsening economic situation in Sri Lanka. It's worth repeating that Sri Lanka is experiencing its worst economic crisis in a lifetime, with food inflation running at over 90%, a large majority of its people receiving reduced incomes, significant hunger, with 8.7 million people inadequately fed, including millions of children, widespread and severely limited access to healthcare, with even basic drugs in desperately short supply.
We should give way just on that point briefly. I think it's important. In this debate that we try and get across the understanding of Sri Lanka's economy itself. It has natural resources on a scale that any other country would wish for, dream of. Natural mineral resources, agricultural resources. And the problem that we have here is actually a political and military complex that now controls that economy to its own interest. And as a result of that, we have these extremes of wealth and poverty, not just through mismanagement, but by calculated management by this military that dominates the economy.
Thank you, and you're absolutely right, and thanks for that intervention to remind us of that situation. It's absolutely clear. Sri Lanka, in fact, has defaulted on $55 billion worth of debt, declaring bankruptcy, causing this widespread misery for its citizens. It doesn't even have enough foreign exchange reserves from which to buy the essentials for its citizens. After months of delay, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, has reached a staff-level agreement on an extended fund facility arrangement. But behind closed doors, no one actually knows what has been agreed. The Sri Lankan people are experiencing the deepest austerity in a country that is already on its knees, with its people starving and dying from lack of food, medicines and fuel, despite the natural resources and wealth of the country. Protesters took to the streets to demand their voices be heard in 3 popular uprisings to end the Rajapaksa dynasty and demand a new democracy when the new president was sworn in this year, which the state has responded to brutally despite the protests being non-violent and peaceful. Remarkably, it has brought demonstrators from different communities together, with protests spreading out rather than being focused on Colombo alone. However, there is an enormous wave of state repression taking place in Sri Lanka at present. The entrenchment of all executive power in the presidency has caused the politicisation of all arms of the state, leading to corruption, mismanagement, impunity, and the brutal denial of human rights. It's the new president, Ranil Wickremesinghe, launched a brutal attack on the protesters and started a new wave of repressions. Human rights organisations, including the UNHRC, have said the executive presidency, who has entrenched an exceedingly authoritarian rule, must end the use of terror laws against protesters. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act was used on Tamils for over 30 years and on Muslims after the Easter Sunday suicide bomb attacks on a massive and barbaric scale. The states have again begun to use its atrocities against peaceful protesters. Despite criticism from the Sri Lankan Supreme Court, the government has also recently planned to introduce a Bureau of Rehabilitation bill that would essentially see the building of mass internment camps where protesters fighting for democracy would be sent to rot. We must never forget that there were large-scale corruption by the Rajapaksa regime, including the stealing of funds from the bilateral private credit lines the country procured. Information, as we know, has come to light that there could be $10 billion of the current foreign reserves hiding in overseas accounts, including in tax havens in UK territories such as the Cayman Islands. Along with other nations in the global south who suffer at the hands of a global economy that favours the global north, we must call on multilateral institutions to cancel debt collection at this critical time, as we did for Ukraine. The UK government must also take a stand against the current repression of mass arrests of peaceful protesters. We must push the Sri Lankan government to end the use of terror laws on its protesters, stop the cruel Rehabilitation Bureau bill from passing and assist the country in repatriation funds that could be easily hiding in the UK and in our overseas territories. It's worth noting that Amnesty International's recent report on the crises points out the vital importance and opportunity to offer a debt amnesty to Sri Lanka and a package of international aid tied to action from the government to resolve its human rights issues, bring justice for war crimes and abuses, and implement a universal approach to social protections. Any response from the UK to the crises that does not involve cast iron commitment to take a role in these solutions is inevitably going to be inadequate, and it's vital that the government puts Amnesty International's proposed solutions at the heart of its actions. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm really pleased to speak in this. And can I first of all thank the Honourable Gentleman for Carshalton and Wallingham for bringing this forward, for setting the scene so very well. And it's never easy to listen to some of the atrocities when they're explicitly told. I always find it quite difficult to respond and listen to those things, because they quite annoy me. I think they annoy us all, to be fair. But to think of the brutality of man upon woman, or man upon man, or man upon children, is something that really quite disturbs me. So I thank the Honourable Gentleman for doing that. I declare an interest, Madam Deputy Speaker, as Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for International Freedom of Religion or Belief. Being Chair of this group, I believe, has given me perhaps a deep insight into the issue of persecution, the abuse of rights to freedom of religion or belief, and its impact upon wider society, including the economic situation of a country. I'm really pleased to hear some of the fantastic speeches by Right Honourable and Honourable members today, with a depth of knowledge of this subject matter in this country in particular, and I know that that's added to the debate, and we look very much forward, I think, to the Minister's response and what we can do in this country to help those Sri Lankans who have been abused so terribly over the last period of time. I think the Honourable Lady, forgive me if I don't, I just can't recall her constituency, but she referred to the amount of money that was spent on. Thank you, the Honourable Lady for Chipping Barnett. Thank you for that. She had mentioned the very issue of the money that was spent on military equipment. And the reason why that caught my attention was because about 2 to 3 weeks ago, I think there was a story in the local press, sorry, the press, the national press, saying that the Sri Lankan government spent a vast amount of money on military equipment that they couldn't even pay for. So it really makes me wonder how any country or company would sell if they don't have the ability to pay it. But it does underline the issue. And the Honourable Lady referred to as also, this is reinforced by a suppressive security policy by the Sri Lankan government, a corrupt, violent, brutal government that must be held accountable for their deadly crimes, be it their officers, be it their soldiers, or whoever it may be, needs to be made accountable, as others have said. I want to specifically focus, if I can, upon the persecution issue. Just 3 years ago, Sri Lanka ranked 30 on the Open Doors World Watch list, a list of the top 50 countries where Christians are persecuted for their faith. This year it dropped off the list, not because the situation is getting better for Christians or other ethnic groups in Sri Lanka, but because persecution of religious or belief minority is getting worse around the world. So they're still there, carrying out despicable crimes, human rights issues, persecution of religious groups, and they haven't stopped. And I want to illustrate that by some of the things that are happening just in Sri Lanka in the last period of time. Very happy to, of course.
Thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way, and he's making a very powerful contribution, and he spoke importantly about what we as members and what this government can do. Does he agree with me that cutting international aid is possibly one of the worst things that we can do, and in fact what we need is an increase, and as the Right Honourable Lady on the Labour bench has said, properly implementing those Magnitsky sanctions that this government has roundly failed to do is also incredibly important.
Thank you for our intervention, and yes, I do agree with that. And hopefully, when the Minister comes to respond, he would maybe give us some encouragement for the request that the Honourable Lady has made and others have made in relation to the foreign aid, and also in relation of the Magnitsky sanctions as well. It is critical that in the current climate of escalating human rights abuses in places like Afghanistan, China, Russia, we do not ignore the plight of Christians and other religious or belief or ethnic minorities in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a diverse country where there are complex divisions between ethnic and religious communities. Freedom of religion or belief is guaranteed by the Constitution. But despite this protection, the abuse of this fundamental right is widespread and has only increased in recent years. Christians, Muslims, Hindus, other religious minorities suffer abusive government regulations which disproportionately affect their communities and endure discrimination that is unnoticed and ignored by authorities, with perpetrators escaping with impunity. Because the law of the land lets that happen, and the government of the land lets it happen. Tensions remain unresolved in the wake of the civil war. Recent terror attacks and the COVID-19 pandemic have worsened it again. I can recall not so many years ago that Sri Lanka was one of those holiday destinations that people wanted to go to, but no more for all the things that are happening. In the last couple of months, changes to Article 291A and 291B of the Penal Code, alongside the Prevention of Terrorism Act and the misuse of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights Acts, have been used to target members of religious minority communities. Again, Minister, I would ask, in relation to those two acts, Article 291A, 291B of the Penal Code, what discussions have taken place with the Sri Lankan government to ensure that those are not used in a detrimental way against religious minority communities, because they are. And if they're being used in an abusive and vindictive and malicious sense, then we need to do something to try and change that. Last month, the US Commission on International Religious Freedom reported the Sri Lankan authorities used these laws to unfairly target minorities and critics of the government. The UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief notes that far from protecting religious communities, blasphemy allegations have ironically become a repressive tool used for curtailing freedom of thought or opinion, conscience and religion or belief. It's always worrying whenever legislation from the land is used in an oppressive, vindictive, violent and malicious way, and this is quite clearly what's happening. False allegations of blasphemy or terrorism have resulted in sentences of 20 years being given to those who criticise the government. Freedom of religion or belief is not just important because it protects the rights of the most vulnerable in a society, but because this right also fosters respect among others, reduces corruption, encourages broader freedoms, and develops the economy and multiples international trust in the country. For me, quite clearly, Madam Chair, as Chair of the APPG for Freedom of Religious Belief, we speak up for those with Christian belief, those with other belief, and those with no belief. And that's what I believe in my heart, because I believe that our God's a God of love. So I seek parity and equality for all those who express a religion and a belief. According to the Pew Research, 8 of the 10 most corrupt countries have high or very high governmental restrictions on religious liberties. In short, religious freedom contributes to better economic and business outcomes. Advances in religious freedom are in the self-interest of businesses, governments and societies. The fact that the Sri Lankan government have such a lax view to human rights and religious liberties is incredibly worrying. As such, when looking at the economic situation in Sri Lanka and trade with the UK, it is vital that we also include a focus on human rights. And in the question just yesterday to the Right Honourable Lady for Berwick-upon-Tweed in a FCDO question, I was able to ask, would the government and the Minister in particular hold the rights of human rights and religious freedom within those deals that government are doing with Sri Lanka? The Honourable Lady, the Right Honourable Lady, replied in a very positive fashion. So I'm hopeful that what we got in a taste yesterday on FCDO questions might just mean that a future where human rights, justice and accountability is key to everything that we do in trade. I finish, Madam Chair, just by saying I would encourage government to ensure that this progress from the Minister's question just yesterday includes the fundamental right to freedom of religion or belief for all. I thank the Honourable Gentleman again for bringing it forward, and all those who have contributed in a very positive way to a debate which unfortunately hasn't much of heartwarming content, but it is because this place gives us a chance to be that voice for the voiceless and speak up for them who have nobody to speak for them. Thank you.
SNP spokesman Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I thank all the speakers who have come previously for what's really an important and timely debate given the ongoing current situation in Sri Lanka, and also particularly to the Honourable Member for Kilshalton, Wellington, who's been impassioned and very detailed and evidenced for what he's demonstrated through his speech, so thank you again. Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst governments and politicians bear responsibility for most of the woes affecting the country, it is ordinary Sri Lankan citizens who are suffering because of policies out with their control. The economic crisis has resulted in severe shortages of imported goods and rampant inflation, pushing millions of people into poverty. Indeed, Sri Lanka has the 5th largest food price inflation in the world, with the year-on-year food inflation rate at nearly 94% and rice costing 150% more than this time last year. This is having a devastating impact on the population, with 6.3 million people. Just to give you a scale, that's more than the entire population of Scotland. Over 30% of the country regarded as food insecure and requiring humanitarian assistance according to the World Food Programme. As a consequence, 1 in 5 children under 5 are stunted, and 1 in 6 of children under 5 are suffering from wasting. It's truly hard to believe. The economic crisis is therefore a humanitarian crisis. The global north, which of course the UK is part of, must ensure that this is not exacerbated and must ensure that Sri Lankans aren't punished for policies and circumstances that they have no power over. In the immediate term, the foremost priority must be the provision of humanitarian assistance. It is therefore right that the SCDO has pledged a humanitarian aid package to Sri Lanka through its commitment of £3 million to be delivered through the Red Cross and the UN partners. Though we in the SNP welcome any increased aid commitments, given the acute crisis in the country, current levels of financial support will barely touch the sides. Given that the UK spent significantly more in Sri Lanka in the past, and that the situation has worsened, with the country now facing its worst economic crisis since its independence in 1948, there must be a dramatic increase in bilateral and multilateral aid commitments. Furthermore, the UK Government must pledge to include and consult local and grassroots NGOs in all bilateral talks on UK ODA to Sri Lanka to ensure that aid can be spent most effectively for the greatest gain for local people. All this, of course, will only be possible if the UK Government categorically rules out any possibility of a further cut to the aid budget and reinstate it to 0.7% of GNI. That means that next week's budget needs to see a restoration, as too many lives are being lost already. To allow the Sri Lankan economy to reform without crippling fiscal pressure, we in the SNP believe that more radical support is required rather than debt restructuring or debt relief, and call on Sri Lanka's debt to be cancelled, so that funds can be input into local communities rather than transferred directly to repay debts from the global north. While economic mismanagement by successive governments has weakened Sri Lanka's public finances, external forces which have exacerbated the crisis cannot be ignored. Sri Lanka's tourism sector was deeply affected by the 2019 Easter bombings, many of us in here saw on our screens or perhaps visited since then, and has never really fully recovered before the COVID-19 pandemic brought about this industry to a complete standstill. In the International Development Select Committee, of which I'm a member, in the January report on COVID-19 in developing countries, the committee found that, and I quote, to mitigate the looming economic crisis in highly indebted developing countries, the UK government advocated for debt relief at a multilateral level. The committee added that the government should consider options for the cancellation of debt and provide this committee with the rationale behind its decisions on debt relief versus debt cancellation for low and middle income countries. And I just urge the Minister, we're still awaiting a reply. Given the impact of COVID-19 and the deterioration of the situation since Sri Lanka is precisely the kind of country which could be considered for debt cancellation measures rather than debt relief measures. Furthermore, given Sri Lanka sources 45% of its wheat imports and over 50% of its sunflower oil, seeds, copper, steel, iron and potassium chloride from Russia and Ukraine, and they are two key markets for Sri Lankan black tea exports, Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine helped bring the country's economy to a breaking point. In light of Sri Lanka's socio-economic crisis, the state funds should not be sent to the likes of Washington DC to repay international debt. It should be used to rebuild the country and urgently invest in vital services for struggling Sri Lankans. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the economic and humanitarian crisis cannot be addressed in isolation, and protecting human rights and adequately addressing and reconciling the country's past is also critical to supporting long-term stability in Sri Lanka. Indeed, Human Rights Watch have stated that Sri Lanka's foreign partners who are working to address the economic crisis need to remember that steps towards lasting stability won't succeed without protecting rights and addressing past abuses. Madam Deputy Speaker, The 26-year-long civil war between the separatist liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam and the Sri Lankan government was marked by countless atrocities, many of which you've heard here today, and indeed has been suggested has been as genocide. I also share those views, and as does my party.
Hear, hear.
I'd also like to add I've visited Sri Lanka several times in the last 12 years, first of which was in 2010, shortly after the war, and I made a point as an individual going up to Jaffna to listen to very brave voices talk about their very recent experiences of the war. I also was back in 2016 with the Westminster Foundation of Democracy, precisely to discuss peace and reconciliation as a result of the war. And I want to pay tribute to all those voices who, in fear and trepidation, came to speak to me about their experiences, about the tens of thousands that have disappeared, or worse, we don't know where they are, and the total inactivity by the governments, both at post-2010 and 16, to try and recourse the balance. Yet, as we know, many of the same people in Sri Lankan political power today hold senior positions in 2009 when the war ended. Former President Rajapaksa was the defence chief during the war and stands accused of committing serious human rights violations both during and after the Sri Lankan civil war. In July, when he was ousted from the presidency, he fled protests in a military plane, having granted himself executive powers to do, but is now back in the country and has never faced accountability for these human rights violations. While President, he pardoned and released former Army Staff Sergeant Sunil Ratnayake, who was convicted in 2015 for the murder of 8 civilians, including children, in Jaffna in 2000. Madam Deputy Speaker, without comprehensive transparency, accountability and reconciliation for crimes committed in Sri Lanka over these years, the country will never be able to fully heal from the trauma and legacy of the Civil War. In 2021, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights concluded that domestic efforts to ensure justice for victims of Sri Lankan Civil War have failed, and failed completely. And I quote, "Despite commitments made in 2015, the current government, like its predecessor, has failed to pursue genuine truth-seeking or accountability processes. The impacts on thousands of survivors from all communities is devastating. Moreover, the systems, structures, policies and personnel that gave rise to such grave violations in the past remain and have recently been reinforced." Those are the words from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, the UK has had a role to play in taking steps towards conflict resolution projects in Sri Lanka, primarily through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, which has built anti-bribery and corruption capacity in the civil servants and judiciary, strengthened policing, community policing, and police response to gender and human rights, and cleared high-density minefields. But I must repeat for the umpteenth time in this chamber, yet again, this is jeopardised by wider aid cuts, which must be reversed urgently if the UK government is to be serious about peace-building and reconciliation projects in Sri Lanka. Furthermore, as an ally of Sri Lanka, the UK government also needs to do more to ensure accountability for heinous acts committed during the Civil War. And the UK government must encourage Sri Lankan counterparts to establish a hybrid war crimes court with the participation of the international judges and prosecutors, or for these war crimes to be investigated by the International Criminal Tribunal if this is not possible. The UK government must also acknowledge that it cannot be business as usual. It's an affront to our own democracy, let alone to those who are suffering in Sri Lanka, in bilateral relations with Sri Lanka, and must stress the importance of political accountability, transparency and rule of law with Sri Lankan counterparts. And as we know, human rights abuses are continuing today, and the UK government must be prepared to impose Magnitsky sanctions on government and military officials that continue to violently clamp down on Sri Lankan protesters, as we've heard here today, as well as individuals such as the Chief of Defence Staff, Shivendra Silva, who is accused of deliberately shelling hospitals and civilians, involvement in sexual violence, extrajudicial executions and enforced disappearances during the Civil War, and has already been sanctioned by the US. Given Sri Lanka is still scarred by a history of ethno-nationalist conflict, any new political disorder can exacerbate historic tensions and spark further outbreaks of violence, and proactive prevention of this must also be a priority. It's simply not enough for the international community to simply condemn acts of ethno-religious discrimination and violence. These condemnations must be backed up with a clear and strong diplomatic agenda and comprehensive monitoring mechanisms. One particular tool, Madam Deputy Speaker, would be an atrocity prevention strategy, which we in the SNP have long called for. In the FCDO's International Development Strategy published in May 2022, the UK Government made a vague commitment to, and I quote, to establish a new conflict and atrocity prevention hub. Any such strategy must include atrocity reporting and monitoring mechanisms in UK embassies around the world, and focus on prevention-first policy thinking instead of policy focused on purely punitive measures post-atrocity. The UK Government therefore must present their plans for scrutiny and pledge to expand its atrocity prevention work, as needed for countries such as Sri Lanka. The UK's response to human rights and economic situation must ensure that power is placed back in the hands of Sri Lankan people so that they may exercise full potential, economic and social accountability over their leaders. And I'll finish by saying this. The legacy of the past and the violations that continue must be addressed by the Sri Lankan Government, the UK and other international actors. However, this cannot stop us from providing the urgent relief that is required, and that needs to be done now. So less words, more action, and let's hear it from the Minister. Thank you.
Hear, hear. Shadow Minister Catherine West.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm aware that there is one more debate to fit in before we adjourn, so I'll be relatively brief because I think my colleague from the SNP has covered quite a lot of ground, as have the excellent speakers from today, and could I congratulate the members who brought this very good debate to the House today, and the very comprehensive speech which the member for Carshalton introduced to the House. There were a couple of points I wanted to emphasise. The long-standing campaigning role that the member for Mitcham and Morden has always had on this issue, and the fact that she's always been a champion for her Tamil constituents in that regard. The member for Slough talked about the increased militarisation and the disproportionate cost and public spending on more arms and less on food and basics, which is clearly what Sri Lankan people need right now. The member for Hayes and Harlington reminded the House of the worrying levels of corruption throughout the Rajapaksa years, and the member for Ealing North talked about the arbitrary detention of civilians during the disruptive events of the last few months. It isn't that long ago since we actually had a very good urgent question on this, so there is some update that I'd like from the Minister, but the most important thing is just to reiterate our friendship with Sri Lankan people and our commitment to the basics so that Sri Lankan people can keep going in what is a very tough economic climate for them, and that the UK play its role in developing a really good package with the IMF. I think the figure of 2.9 billion appears in the House of Commons briefing paper, but that indeed we do bring our concerns as well as the economic picture of what needs to happen relating to the human rights abuses from the 2009 civil war. We have often, as members, had delegations from Tamils to our MP constituency events, and certainly in Hornsey and Wood Green, I have had Tamils who have come to see me very worried about disappeared relatives, about the tragic events which the member for Carshalton so intimately described in his speech. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are... Of course.
I'm very grateful to her for giving way. On those tragic events, the Honourable Member for Dundee West mentioned the case of Shavendra Silva. Does my honourable friend agree that our government should be using the powers it now has to sanction people overseas? He has been sanctioned by the US. Shouldn't we be doing the same?
Member for New East Ham brings a really important point to the House, which is one that I'd like to ask the Minister, and I'll get onto that right now, to see what his assessment is now that the UK has left the EU and has more flexibility around sanctions, whether this individual might be the subject of a sanction. And I wonder what his assessment of that important Magnitsky-style sanctions, which are so powerful, whether this individual could be subject to that kind of sanction. Could I also ask the Minister what recent engagement he or other colleagues within the FCDO have had with the Government of Sri Lanka, both on the economic situation so that the crisis can be concluded and that Sri Lanka can get back to being the tourist destination which it relies on so heavily for its economy. Secondly, whether the British government has proposed conditionality on the IMF funding so that we can reflect back what the concerns from this House are within that discussion about finance. Thirdly, what steps the government's taking to support measures to bring to justice those accused of human rights abuses. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe this afternoon we've had an excellent airing of the debate. Throughout the last 6 months, we have had urgent questions as well on Sri Lanka, and we await the Minister's assessment on those key points. And I wonder whether I could press him as well to convene with the Minister in the other House, Lord Ahmed, who I understand is intimately aware of all these issues as well, to really press the 2 points, the economy, which comes up in this motion, and I note that the government is accepting the motion as it stands, and secondly, on these important human rights issues which Tamil constituents have brought to our surgeries and which we want to hear answers on, and whether he would also put anything else in the way of detail in the House of Commons library so that we can send that on to our constituents and they can be assured that we have had a full debate about the human rights picture and a full debate about the desperate economic situation facing the people of Sri Lanka. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'm very pleased to respond to this debate, and I thank the Honourable Member for Carshalton and Wallington for leading this debate, and the Honourable Members for Richmond Park, East Ham and Chipping Barnet for securing it. And we've had a number of very moving contributions reflecting the deep humanitarian and economic crisis afflicting the country of Sri Lanka, and I'm very grateful for those contributions. Additionally, we heard from the Honourable Members from Mitcham and Morden, the Right Honourable Member for Kingston and Surbiton, Richmond Park, Ealing North, Leicester East, Strangford, and of course the opposition spokespersons from Dundee West and Hornsey and Wood Green. I should say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that of course Minister Anne-Marie Trevelyan is now the lead Government Minister on our relations with Sri Lanka, but I'm pleased to take this debate on her behalf, and I will briefly reflect on the activities of Lord Ahmed, who until now has held that brief, in my following remarks. Of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK and Sri Lanka have had a long shared history. Many UK citizens and parliamentarians themselves have very close ties with that country. We've heard members speak movingly of their experiences in Sri Lanka today. It's, of course, a relationship which really does matter to the UK, and it's been extremely difficult for us all to witness Sri Lanka's recent economic decline, because it is an economic crisis made worse by of course, dreadful mismanagement, long-term mismanagement, as well as the economic fallout from the terrible 2019 Easter Sunday attacks and the COVID pandemic and Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. So in terms of what the British government is doing about it, Madam Deputy Speaker, of course we believe a stable and inclusive political settlement is an essential foundation for economic recovery and growth over the long term in Sri Lanka. And my honourable friend, the Noble Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon, made this point to Sri Lankan President Wickremesinghe in July and to the Sri Lankan Prime Minister Gunawardena in August. And of course he urged progress both in terms of human rights and accountability as well as economic reform. Because, Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK is providing economic support through a number of institutions, including the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, the Asian Development Bank and the Paris Club. And as has been mentioned here today, we welcome the initial September staff level agreement with the IMF for a 4-year support programme of some $3 billion. Now, of course, while this agreement represents a positive milestone for Sri Lanka, continued negotiations are needed to achieve final programme approval and a route to restore macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability. Today, the honourable members, some honourable members have proposed conditionalities on IMF assistance. Of course, the IMF does not have the ability within its governance structure to impose political or human rights-linked conditionality, only conditionality that is linked to economic policy. But of course, we want human rights progress to advance in tandem with economic progress, and we will use other mechanisms to hold the Sri Lankans to account and progress human rights in that regard. Very briefly, I'm happy to indulge her very briefly.
Can I emphasise that these international bodies, if they're allowed to impose conditions in relation to economic matters, should be imposing conditions in relation to military spending and cronyism and corruption? These are reasonable asks of any bailout.
So comments, but we seek to have conditionality interlinking to our approach in international multilateral forums with regard to human rights. We're using the UN to essentially push forward human rights. So in addition to our economic support through institutions, the UK government has also provided humanitarian assistance. Madam Deputy Speaker, we announced £3 million of humanitarian support in September. This will be delivered through the Red Cross and United Nations partners as part of our ongoing humanitarian response. It is of course important that humanitarian assistance reaches those who need it most, wherever they are in the country, and that's something we want to see. We are also providing support through the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund. The UK is the largest donor to the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, contributing more than £1.7 billion since its inception in 2006, and the fund has already provided $5 million to Sri Lanka. Now, I would like to address the question raised by the Honourable Gentleman for Kingston and Surbiton about conditionality with regard to trade discussions. Now, of course, the generalised scheme of trade preferences, the EU scheme to which he referred, that will be replaced by our new developing countries trading scheme in early next year. And under this new scheme of preferences, the UK will retain the power to suspend a country on the grounds of human rights violations. So I take his point, and I'm pleased to confirm that we will have that capacity in the future under our new arrangement. I'm afraid I really can't because Okay, very briefly.
Mr. Giving way, I'm afraid I'm not sure if he's read the House from all sides or the motion today. It's not a question whether the government has the capacity to take this, whether they're going to use that capacity to send the message that this House wants to send. We are not prepared to put up any longer with the way the Sri Lankan government is treating many of the citizens, not least from the Tamil community.
Indeed, I note his intervention with gratitude. And I hope I've offered him reassurance by noting we do have that capacity, and I'm not going to make pronouncements from the dispatch box today about our plans, but I think that is reassuring to members to know that we maintain that freedom of movement in terms of our future trading relationship with Sri Lanka. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, turning now explicitly to the human rights situation, of course, the comprehensive report issued by the Office for the High Commissioner on Human Rights, which has been mentioned today, highlighted a number of profound concerns. There continues to be a lack of progress on basic human rights and post-conflict accountability. The report also highlights economic crimes and the link to a lack of accountability and the need to ensure the most vulnerable continue to receive support. Minority communities continue to face discrimination and harassment by state authorities. In the north and the east of the country, where Tamils and Muslims are the majority, schemes that emphasise Buddhist hegemony continue to aggravate tensions. And for 2 years, provincial council elections have been delayed under the promise of electoral reform, denying a voice for local and minority groups. Protest leaders have been arbitrarily or unlawfully arrested, and the state of emergency powers have been extensively used. The government of Sri Lanka have made numerous commitments to the international community to address this situation. They have promised to repeal the Prevention of Terrorism Act and implement legislation that is compliant with international human rights standards. The government have also promised to implement a proper accountability mechanism to establish truth, reconciliation and justice. And we will continue to call on Sri Lanka to make progress on human rights and accountability. And we will continue to work with international partners to hold the government of Sri Lanka to its promises. We have supported efforts to promote human rights and peace and reconciliation in Sri Lanka for many years. And of course, in October, we worked with partners in the UN to agree the new resolution on Sri Lanka, which has been mentioned many times today, Resolution 51.1, to extend the mandate to report on the realities on the ground and to preserve and protect evidence of past human rights violations and abuses for future accountability processes. So this international framework ensures that Sri Lanka remains on the international human rights agenda, and we believe this diplomatic approach is the best way to encourage progress. However, we do recognise that sincere and sustainable progress on human rights and accountability must be led by the people of Sri Lanka. Over the last 3 years, we have spent more than £10 million from our Conflict, Stability and Security Fund to support peace building, social cohesion and gender equality, as well as to strengthen democratic institutions. And Lord Ahmed of Wimbledon met Sri Lankan Foreign Minister Ali Sabri in September to urge progress and to renew our offer to work with Sri Lanka. Now, a number of honourable and right honourable members have mentioned sanctions today. Of course, the government would not speculate from the dispatch box on possible designations because, of course, that would reduce their impact. But we keep all evidence and potential listings under close review. To conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, the people of Sri Lanka are experiencing an unprecedented economic crisis and they continue to face violations of human rights and barriers to justice. In response to the economic situation, the UK government has provided direct humanitarian assistance, financial support through multilateral institutions, and we continue to pursue options for debt relief through all of this, ensuring the poorest and most vulnerable continue to receive support at this time is absolutely critical. And we will continue to support the Sri Lankan people in their pursuit of justice and accountability and for progress on human rights, including at the UN Human Rights Council. Sri Lanka is an important and valued friend of the United Kingdom, and this government will do all we can to help the Sri Lankan people achieve the prosperous and peaceful future they deserve. Thank you.
Elliot Colburn.
Speaker, I'm aware there's a very important debate to follow, so I'll just be very brief. I would like to again thank the Backbench Business Committee for granting us the chance to discuss this today, and can I thank all colleagues who co-sponsored and spoke throughout the course of today's debate. I would urge the government to revisit their strategies when it comes to trying to promote human rights on the island of Sri Lanka. Many Tamils will feel like we've been here before. We really do need to see bilateral action from the UK in order to secure the action, the peace, the accountability and the justice that Tamils have been waiting for. Madam Deputy Speaker, I beg to move the motion.
Thank you. The question is, as on the order paper, is that opinion